This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
U.S. House of Representatives to vote on President Donald Trump's impeachment. World leaders pledge in excess of $2.5 billion to support refugees. And the Senegalese acrobat moves dazzling crowds despite his disability. Hello and welcome to Africa Live, only on CGTN. I'm Karen Roberts, live in Nairobi. Raman Nyang joins you now with all your business headlines.
That's right, Karen. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. The Kenyan carrier Kenya Airways has issued a profit warning. Earnings are going to fall by more than 25%. And Nigeria's president has signed off on a record $34.6 billion budget on time for the 2020 fiscal year. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming up in the course of the hour. For now, though, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Karen.
Thank you very much, Rana. Well, let's start in the United States, where the Democrat-led House of Representatives will vote today on whether to impeach President Donald Trump on the grounds of abuse of power and obstructing Congress. Trump is accused of pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rival and former Vice President Joe Biden, as well as obstructing the impeachment process. Donald Trump has insisted that he has done nothing wrong. He's also, in a letter, lashed out at House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, accusing her of declaring open war on American democracy. Tens of thousands of people across the country have marched in support of impeachment. Moving on to other news now, the United States of America is calling on the parties to South Sudan's 2018 peace agreement to fully implement the deal. The U.S. ambassador to South Sudan says Washington is encouraged by an agreement reached between President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar to form a unity government in February next year. However, the U.S. would like to see action that can move the peace process forward. CGTN's Patrick Hoyt reports.
The U.S. says the current peace deal remains the only option for South Sudan to move away from civil war. The U.S. ambassador to South Sudan has just returned from Washington, where he was recalled for what Washington says were consultations on the re-evaluation of the relationship between South Sudan and the U.S. The U.S. ambassador says Washington has resolved to engage more with South Sudanese leaders to push the peace process forward. Thomas Hashek says the U.S. will continue to discourage the obstruction of peace in South Sudan. The U.S. has this week sanctioned 2 South Sudanese government officials. Those sanctioned are the current ministers of cabinet affairs and of defense.
We are looking at all spoilers to the peace process. If the process moves forward, this is the way to prevent future sanctions. Even the people that have been sanctioned so far, if they demonstrate changes in behavior and they become supporters and protectors of the peace process, those sanctions can be removed as well.
The U.S. says it will continue to work with the African Union to ensure peace returns to South Sudan. It urges South Sudan's government to provide freedom for opposition groups, media and civil society groups. Washington is also urging all parties to the peace deal to recommit to protecting humanitarian workers and start the process to amend the constitution to incorporate the peace agreement. The U.S. says there needs to be political will and good leadership to fully implement the deal. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Elsewhere, students, teachers and other demonstrators rallied in their thousands in Algeria's capital on Tuesday against newly elected President Abdelmadjid Tebboune. The demonstrators rejected his offer of dialogue. Abdelmadjid Tebboune won 58.1% of the vote in last Thursday's election and on Friday said he was ready for talks to build a new Algeria. But protesters, long opposed to an election, saw this as a ploy by the establishment to consolidate power. Security security forces were heavily deployed, but there was no confrontation between them and the demonstrators. The protest movement has rocked Algeria since February. Initially, it demanded Bouteflika step down. Then it pushed for the remnants of his regime to make way for new, independent institutions. Tunisia's President Kais Saied has commemorated the start of the uprising that toppled autocrat Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. An independent academic, Kais Saied, was elected in a landslide victory in October and has vowed to honour the demands of the revolution. President Saied made an unscheduled visit to Sidi Bouzid, where the first protests of Tunisia's revolt erupted, sparking the Arab Spring movements in the region. Here, he promised to realise the key demands of the revolution: freedom, work and dignity within the framework of the constitution and with legitimacy. Saied also announced that December the 17th will be a national holiday. The UN has announced a plan to improve security in the Democratic Republic of Congo's northeastern province of Ituri. This should allow the full resumption of Ebola prevention activities in the area. An unidentified militia group carried out 2 attacks on health facilities last month, prompting aid agencies to suspend operations there. CGTN's Chris Ochemringa has more from Kinshasa.
The reinforced security will be carried out by UN agencies in coordination with the Congolese government. More UN peacekeepers will be deployed to protect healthcare workers battling the Ebola outbreak in Biakato and Mangina territories. An attack by men wielding machetes last month left 4 healthcare workers dead. The attack forced some aid agencies to suspend operations and evacuate their staff.
The health workers were deliberately targeted. So this forced us to rethink the way we were securing the Ebola response. We augmented the number of peacekeepers that are based in Biakato. We also built a secure base, and we also put in place some operational and coordination structures to make sure that the frontline health workers receive the appropriate security support that they requested.
Congolese officials say the suspension led to an increase in new Ebola cases. They recorded 27 new cases last week compared to 7 cases in the previous 3 weeks. Most of the new cases were linked to an individual who was reported to have contracted the disease for the 2nd time this year. The person has since died. Health experts say tests they conducted on the patient have shown that the virus was still lurking in the person's immune system. Ebola survivors are believed to be immune to the disease. No case of reinfection have been documented before. The Ebola outbreak in the DRC has claimed more than 2,200 lives since August last year. Insecurity in North Kivu and Ituri provinces is the biggest obstacle healthcare workers are facing in their bid to end the outbreak. Chris Ochemringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Well, let's now return to our top stories, and that is going back to the US, where the Democrat-led House of Representatives is deciding on whether to vote to impeach President Donald Trump. And we are now joined by Jim Spellman, who is monitoring developments there for us. Jim, members have been debating the rules for impeachment since the House opened at 9 o'clock this morning. That's local time. What is the latest so far, and when can we expect this vote?
Right, so after about 3 hours of debating the rules, including several attempts to slow down the procedures by Republicans, they've now moved on from that. The Democrats have read into the official record the articles of impeachment, one charging abuse of power, the other obstruction of Congress, and now it's on to debating those articles of impeachment. That'll be about 6 hours. We can expect a few delays. We expect to vote around 7 p.m. or so, give or take a few hours here at Washington time. The Democrats say they do have the votes to impeach President Trump on both of those counts, but it will be a difficult vote for some of those Democrats that are in the swing districts that supported President Trump 3 years ago and supported them a year ago. But we do expect President Trump to be impeached on both of those articles early in the evening here at Washington time. Karen?
So, Jim, 7 p.m. likely, you say, the vote, that's 7 p.m. Washington time. Take us through the process of impeachment. What happens after the vote?
So the Democrats here in the House will vote to allow Nancy Pelosi to appoint what's called an impeachment manager, something akin to a prosecutor in a criminal trial. It will then move to the Senate, which is controlled by President Trump's Republican Party, for a trial where the senators will, to a certain degree, act like jurors. Already there is a disagreement back and forth between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate about how that procedure will go. The Democrats would like to call witnesses, including the acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, perhaps the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. At this point, Republicans saying they don't want that. There's been some reporting that President Trump would like a large, broad trial that he feels could vindicate him. There's little appetite for that, though, coming from the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. So once we wrap up here, trial in the Senate, that'll happen sometime in January. Karen?
And Jim, finally, no U.S. president has ever been removed from office through the impeachment process. Republican senators aren't likely to change that trend. What are Democrats hoping to achieve with this impeachment move?
Well, what you'll hear in public from some Democrats is that they have to vote their conscience, that this is something that needed to be done to preserve the integrity of the presidency of the United States. But a more cynical response is they would like to damage President Trump leading up to next year's presidential elections. So far, though, there's been little sign of any major movement in the polls heading into this. All that said, though, despite whatever President Trump may say in public, this is clearly a huge blow to his presidency. By the way, President Trump, the White House says he will not be following these proceedings. He travels to Michigan for one of his boisterous campaign rallies this evening. He is expected to speak there around the same time, roughly, that the House will vote this evening. So it will be a major showdown going on here Wednesday evening in Washington. Karen?
Okay, thank you very much for that. That was CGTN's Jim Spellman monitoring developments there over whether to impeach President Donald Trump. We are going to a short break now. Don't go away. Lots more to come.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines.
You've got to get out, go there, and you'll find them. In the bazaars of Casablanca. Among the crowds in Cairo.
Who come to visit Cairo, the ancient capital of Egypt.
Along the waters of the Nile. Along the sands of the Sahara. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. No one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
The first ever global refugee forum has concluded in Geneva in Switzerland. A number of significant pledges were made, including a $2.5 billion commitment in aid for migrants from the World Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank approved $100 million to support countries that have more than 0.5% of their populations being refugees. The Vodafone Foundation committed to provide a high-quality digital education to more than 500,000 young refugees in Kenya, Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The company's trained employee volunteers will support teacher training and provide technical assistance on the ground.
The Inter-American Development Bank own resources will be blended with additional grants from donors and partners and co-financing from public and private donors, expecting to leverage a total of $1 billion in concessional financing for a period of the next 3 to 4 years.
This year, the LEGO Foundation is awarding a $100 million grant to a consortium led by the International Rescue Committee to work alongside host governments to improve education outcomes for approximately 800,000 pre-primary and primary school-aged children living in refugee settings in East Africa.
We know that for children and young people in particular who are uprooted by war or persecution, sport is much more than a leisure activity. For refugees, sport is an opportunity to be included and protected, a chance to heal, develop and grow.
Somalia's Prime Minister Hassan Ali Haire led a delegation from his country to Geneva for the Global Refugee Forum. The meeting, it's hoped, will translate the principle of international responsibility for sharing into concrete action. UNHCR's annual Global Trends report, released in June this year, shows that nearly 70.8 million people were displaced at the end of 2018. Some 13.6 million people were newly displaced during the course of the year. Despite its own challenges, Somalia hosts over 35,000 refugees and asylum seekers, mainly from war-torn Yemen. Well, here are some views from Yemeni refugees in Mogadishu on the opportunity for integration, business and education.
I am a Yemeni refugee in Somalia, and I arrived in Mogadishu from the capital, Aden, in 2015 with my family and hundreds of others. We fled the violence in our country. We have freedom just like Somali citizens, and we appreciate the people and government of Somalia for their warm welcome.
I arrived with my family in Mogadishu as a refugee in June 2015. Life here is better than back home. We have no problem except normal security challenges around that we share with citizens.
I am a teacher who arrived in Somalia as a refugee from Yemen in 2014. We appreciate the warm welcome by the federal government of Somalia. We have historic relations with Somalia. We welcomed them as refugees, and now they have done the same, which is a great feeling.
The International Organization for Migration is warning that illegal migration from Ethiopia is on the rise as the world marks International Migrants Day. Here's Coletta Wanjoe with the story from Addis Ababa.
According to the IOM, many Ethiopians migrate illegally through the eastern route which connects the Horn of Africa to the Persian Gulf.
We have seen many deportations from the Middle East. We saw one wave in 2013 and beginning of 2014. And right now, we've seen a new wave of deportations with close to 300, actually more than 300,000 Ethiopians deported from Saudi Arabia in the last year and a half. And that's a huge number.
Ethiopia banned migration for domestic work to the Middle East in 2014 with an aim of curbing human traffickers. But even as it lifted the ban in 2018, the challenge persists. This year, IOM assisted hundreds of Ethiopians who were stuck in prison in war-torn Yemen. 15 reportedly died when a boat that was smuggling them into Yemen broke down and left them in the sea. In November, the government said 1,300 Ethiopians were trapped in Tanzania on their way to South Africa.
Policy incoherence is the reason that there is irregular migration, when there is need for labor migrants, but that need is not recognized by governments. It's the human smugglers and people traffickers that take charge of the process of matching labor supply to labor demand. So what we would want to see is governments take charge and be at the center of this process.
The Office of the Attorney General has prepared a new draft bill introducing harsher penalties, including death against human traffickers. This as the government works with its partners to enlighten communities about the vices of human trafficking.
We reached out to over 2,000 communities through our community mobilizers and highlighting the perils of doing irregular migration, what comes with it, what are the risks involved, and we see raised awareness now among the communities.
But IOM says many others, mostly those who are not educated, continue to believe human traffickers who assure them that they will be safe. And even when they are deported, some still attempt the same dangerous journey. Colette Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
The United Nations uses this day to raise awareness about the challenges and the difficulties of international migration. Let's look at how some migrants are coping in Uganda and Rwanda.
Fine-tuning a new beginning. Paluku Adela is a music producer from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Since 2003, he's had to adjust to life in Uganda, but says it's tough being an immigrant here.
To fit into the industry here in Uganda, remember we have a lot of competitions in Uganda. We found big people, big producers.
The language barrier is another challenge he faces.
My first recording in the studio in Uganda was in Luganda, by where the guy I was recording didn't know how to speak Swahili, didn't know how to speak English, only Luganda. Remember, I don't know Luganda. Remember, I don't know English by then. So I could do all the sign to make myself understanding with the guy. I could at least to bring that harmony through signs.
And many refugees face the same challenges. Many migrants like Adele come to Uganda seeking refuge, but also for better opportunities. While some have made it, others are still struggling to settle in because they have to compete with locals for jobs and limited resources. Uganda is home to over 1 million refugees. Experts say many migrants are driven to relocate because of economic instability in their home countries. But integrating these vast numbers is still a challenge.
Countries like Uganda, where opportunities are fewer even for locals, there will be, yes, competition over resources, available opportunities, which naturally can create issues.
Like many migrants, Adela has chosen to make Uganda his second home and take advantage of the country's peaceful environment. And as refugees continue to come to Uganda, it's hoped they will create opportunities for themselves, which will in turn contribute to the local economy. Hilara Isga, CGTN, Kampala.
Flowers and grass stalks make the room festive. They set the stage for the ceremony that will take place here later today. It is a celebration to mark the baptism of a little baby boy. Babies are reason to celebrate under normal circumstances, but this one is even more special. He was born to refugee parents in Libya, and now he and his parents have arrived at the United Nations Emergency Transit Center in Gashora, Rwanda, on their way to a new life. 306 refugees call this camp home. 24-year-old Simon left home in Eritrea for Libya in 2017, seeking safe passage to the better life he believed awaited him in Europe.
My family, my father and my dad, they spent their whole years, their whole time in order to serve me, a good future. They sent me to a good school. They gave me whatever I want until I was a teenager. So it's time for me to give back to my family. We thought Libya was a place for us just to cross the sea.
But he didn't make it to Europe. He, like thousands of refugees and asylum seekers, was detained in Libya after being rescued or intercepted at sea by the Libyan Coast Guard. After an agreement with the African Union, Rwanda agreed to temporarily take in at least 500 of these immigrants who mainly come from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia and Sudan.
When they told us that we are going to be evacuated from Libya, the first thing that we done is we raise our hand to God and we thank Him. It was like we were born again and again, so we were so happy.
The United Nations Refugee Agency provides the migrants with housing and food. They're also learning the local languages so that they can integrate with the local community and their children can get an education.
The community actually is good, really. They can respect us, even we respect them. We live in a good, we interact with them, good way.
They haven't been here long, but these refugees have found a semblance of normalcy in this camp. They have formed relationships and found routines. And though they are still waiting to be settled, here they have found community. Authorities say the evacuated refugees can return to their homeland, be sent to a third country or stay in Rwanda. Some of the evacuees, however, still dream of starting a beautiful new life overseas.
I'm waiting to reach to Europe, maybe to a place where I can repay my family's debt. I have a lot of debts. When I reach Europe, I will work hard. I will get what I was thinking, and I hope they will be still alive until I repay them.
But now they dream in safety, and every day they remember the over 4,500 immigrants the United Nations Refugee Agency says are still detained in Libya. And when they find a reason to celebrate, they do. Every little freedom, every celebration has been hard-won, and they believe there's more to come yet. Wilkisanyabo, CGTN, Gashora, Rwanda.
Ethiopia's first satellite, ETRSS-1, heads into orbit on Friday. This remote sensing satellite is expected to be used for agriculture, predicting disasters and improving forest development, among other things. An Ethiopian delegation is already in China, from where the satellite will be launched. Talks have also been held with Chinese counterparts in Beijing for future negotiations. CGTN's Gurum Chala reports.
ETRSS-1 will soon join other satellites in orbit with an Ethiopian flag on it. Ethiopia's delegation, led by the Minister of Innovation and Technology, is already here in China to witness the launching of this historic satellite.
For me, it feels like the 1957, that the first ever object, man-made object was put in place, and that is Sputnik by the Russians in 1957. So for me now, I feel like that exactly. So this is the first ever Ethiopian object, Ethiopian satellite to be put in space.
Part of the delegation to China is also Ethiopia's head of Space Science and Technology Institute. He says the satellite to be launched will be highly instrumental for the country.
The purpose of ETRSS-1 are three important purposes. The first one is really to introduce our engineers with a new technology and transfer knowledge and technology to Ethiopia. And the second one is building national image and showing Ethiopia is able to explore space. We have an instrument that can explore from the ground into space using the telescope. Now from space into the Earth. And the third one is, since our economy is mainly based on agriculture, then this remote sensing satellite is used to analyze and bringing the different images of the agriculture and water management system, mining system, and environmental monitoring.
This microsatellite is not only the first of its kind for the Eastern Africa state, but also an historic eye-opener for similar missions coming up. Ethiopia is already holding talks with Chinese counterparts for a 6,000 kilograms communications and broadcasting satellite launch as soon as possible.
The next milestone that we need to celebrate is a 6,000 kilogram first Ethiopian communication satellite to be put again in space at an altitude of more than 38,000 kilometers on the geostationary orbit, and that's going to happen in 3 years' time. So the feasibility study and other research studies have already been conducted, and what is remaining is the financing part of the project.
ETRSS-1, the multi-spectrum microsatellite, is also motivating Ethiopian authorities to foresee the training of locals as future deep space scientists. The plan here is to send Ethiopian astronauts to space in a decade or a decade and half time. Group Dala CGTN, Beijing, China.
Well, let's now go to Rama for all the latest business news. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Here's what's coming up in business. Kenya Airways is issuing a profit warning. Expect earnings to fall by at least 25%. And Nigeria's president has signed off on a record $34.6 billion budget.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's start in the business of aviation, where Kenya Airways says its earnings for the 2019 fiscal year are very likely to fall by at least 25% or more compared to the prior year. In a profit warning issued to investors earlier today, the loss-making carrier attributed the loss to stiff competition in part. It also says that a recently introduced International Financial Reporting Standards rule, IFRS 16, has compelled it to make significant adjustments to its P&L and balance sheet. Now, last year, Kenya Airways reported a net loss of roughly $74 million. The state-owned company last made a profit in 2012. This year, Kenyan legislators approved plans to renationalize the company. Kenya's government sold significant stakes in the carrier in 1996 to the public and the Dutch airline KLM, becoming the first African national carrier at the time to do so. Still with Kenya Airways, Boeing's plans to temporarily stop the production of the 737 MAX is set to hit the national carrier too. Like many other airlines across the continent, Kenya Airways was betting on that grounded jetliner to replace some or all of its current collection of 737s. The airline has at least 14 of them in service at the moment. 2 of those are dedicated cargo variants and at least 8 passenger-carrying 737-800s. Kenya Airways chair Michael Joseph says that the decision to halt 737 MAX production would not have an immediate effect on airline operations, but it could affect the company's future fleet renewal plans. On to Boeing now. Economists expect that more than 600 smaller companies in the supply chain to Boeing might lay off staff or cut their working hours, all of which will likely show up in the US employment data later on. Boeing plans to stop production, as I just mentioned, of the 737 MAX at the plant in Renton over in Washington state, which has 12,000 employees. They may be assigned to different Boeing facilities in the Seattle area, but the closure of this assembly line may also hurt local enterprises.
Oh, I just hope it's short, and I hope that we get the planes flying again. So Boeing needs to work on its quality, and I think that's become very apparent. And so I look forward to that.
That's like 80% support by Boeing. Yeah, mostly the order like whole group, people vaccine the big order, then they send somebody to pick up the order. So mostly, the whole area is kind of more or less support by Boeing,
On to fiscal matters now. Nigeria's president has approved a record $34.6 billion budget for 2020. Now, the fiscal deficit for that year is forecast to be about 1.5% of GDP. And the West African oil producer is likely to return to international debt markets next year too, as it continues to struggle to shake off the impact of a 2016 recession. Crude oil production is forecast at 2.18 million barrels a day. The oil price assumption has been set at $57 a barrel. However, economists say that even though Nigeria's budgets are large, they're not exactly always realistic, with the amount disbursed each year often falling far short of the projected spending. In North Africa, Tunisia's government has presented a study on reforms to be adopted to deal with a broad range of economic difficulties. Growth this year, for instance, is just forecast at 1.5%. That's just over half the 2018 growth rate. Unemployment in the country is also persistently high at close to 16%, and it's much, much higher among women and young people. Here's CGTN's Anin Chachi with the details.
Tawfiq al-Rajhi shed light on the reforms that have been carried out by successive governments since 2015, indicating that these will help the next government work without pressure.
The minister in charge of major reforms said 3 urgent reforms relating to solidarity and social economy, governance of state-owned enterprises, and social protection should be implemented by the next government.
As for Tunisia's relationship with the International Monetary Fund, the minister noted that only 3 reforms were requested by the IMF.
They relate to the budget law, the establishment of an authority to fight corruption, and reforms in the penal system. Despite the economic and financial conditions faced by the country, 5 IMF reviews were successfully agreed upon under the Extended Fund Agreement 2016 to 2020.
The Tunisian president has been following the latest economic indicators. Qais Said met with the central bank governor in Carthage Palace. Marwan Al-Abbasi briefed the president about the country's current economic situation and the progress of the figures late in 2019.
The economic situation has improved in comparison to the same period last year, but more reforms still need to be implemented. I have informed the president about the positive impact likely to result from Tunisia's exit from the list of jurisdictions, subject to monitoring by the Financial Action Task Force.
Tunisia's major reforms were divided into 6 main areas relating to building state institutions, establishing constitutional bodies, as well as economic, institutional, financial and banking reforms, public finance, and social reforms. The current reform plan provides for improving access to information, administrative services, the digitization of the administration, and the reform of the subsidy system, as well as the governance of the state-owned enterprises. The reform of public companies will be made through financial restructuring. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Now then, on to other matters. Zimbabwe might actually end up seeing the assets of its state mining company seized after a final appeal at the International Court of Arbitration on a 2014 ruling failed. Companies linked to the British Virgin Island-based Amari Holdings won the rights to seize assets worth over $65 million in compensation for Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation's cancellation of nickel and platinum mining ventures that were formed in 2007 and 2008. Now, Zimbabwe's assertion that the deals were not appropriately approved by the ZMDC officials and the nation's mining minister were rejected by the court. Still in that general region, drought is plunging millions in Zambia and Zimbabwe into darkness as water levels in hydroelectric dams that they both rely on continue to dry out. Now, to make matters worse, these rolling blackouts come amid rising debt levels, which have left the 2 Southern African countries unable to import enough power. They simply can't afford it. And even if they could, there's a question of where they would get it. The region's biggest supplier, Eskom, just doesn't have the capacity to keep the lights on in its home market of South Africa and still export excess power elsewhere. The current power crisis in Zambia, Zimbabwe and South Africa is also inflicting economic damage. Zimbabwe's economic output is expected to shrink by about 7% this year. Zambia, on the other hand, is on course for its slowest growth in nearly more than 2 decades, with South Africa likely to enter another recession. Now, as the biggest single trade partner with the continent, China has been running a significant trade surplus with economies here. While that is a growing concern for policymakers and enterprises, it hasn't quite frozen trade and investment flows. Here's CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy now exploring future perspectives of Sino-African ties, starting in the East African state of Kenya.
The Africa Construction Trends launched by consultancy firm Deloitte in December 2018 indicated that Kenya had the highest number of infrastructure projects financed by China across the Eastern African region. Edward Kusewa, a Kenyan development economist and specialist on Sino-Africa issues, says that Chinese-built modern roads and railways have benefited local entrepreneurs besides enhancing linkages with regional trading partners.
Any investment that encourages efficiency in transportation and connectivity is a good thing. Recently, the African Union just ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, which implies the connectivity of regions. That connectivity can only happen if we have a very systemized, broad-based infrastructure network.
According to Kusewa, the Chinese-built Mombasa-Nairobi SGR project has not only revolutionized transport and commerce, but also stimulated investments in rural towns along its corridor.
These relationships are helping Africa and Kenya achieve economic growth and productivity across all sectors, whether you speak about agriculture, whether you speak about manufacturing, whether you speak about the services industry. These relationships in Chinese investment have also been able to bring in new capital, which is concessional capital.
With mutual understanding and support on many international and regional issues, China and Kenya have continued to expand and deepen their cooperation, with trade and economic cooperation between the two countries reaching unprecedented levels. Kenya continues to benefit from infrastructure projects built by the Chinese, with now seamless movement of people and cargo from the port city of Mombasa to the capital, Nairobi. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
And I'll leave it there for the time being. I'll be back at the top of the hour. We'll be exploring Ghana's debt metrics. The country, according to the IMF, is at high risk of debt distress, and now it's warning the country to avoid pledging assets to lend it. We'll look at the collateral problem that Ghana's essentially driving itself into at 1800 GMT. See you then. For now, though, back to Karen.
Thank you very much, Rama. We are going to a short break. Don't go away. Lots more to come, including an acrobat in Senegal dazzles crowds despite disability.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
In Nigeria, traditional or alternative medicine has been used for centuries to cure illnesses, but it's not considered standard medical practice. In the capital, Abuja, one practitioner who works with herbs is trying to build acceptance for traditional medicine. CGTN's Deji Badmus has the story.
It's at places like this that Annie Yoda sources herbs to prepare her medicine. She's one of Nigeria's foremost certified alternative medicine practitioners and acupuncturist.
Here we are in the bush. We have so much that can make one okay. We are blessed with all kinds of plants in this country. We don't need to go to India or Germany for our medication.
When she gathers what she needs from the bush, Yoda brings everything here, where they are processed into a herbal mix to treat any particular ailment. Some of the herbs come in powdery form, and others she capsulates or packages into tea bags with prescriptions for her patients. The healthcare practitioner of 2 decades says she's found natural herbs to be a remedy for ailments that defy modern science. Yoda is also an acupuncturist, having received training from the Beijing Institute for Chinese Traditional Medicine. the Institute of Acupuncture, and the Alternative Medicine Institute, among others. From her clinic in Abuja, she's providing succor to sufferers of diseases.
I could see that there was limited knowledge about treatment. But when I found out that acupuncture is very vast in treatment, that was what interested. And then is that this one gives you instant result and is also curative.
Michael Achimogu is receiving treatment for an ailment he's been treating with orthodox medicine for the past 2 years. He says in less than 3 months of taking Yoda's prescriptions, he's seen remarkable results in his health.
I couldn't go to use the toilet on my own, for like 2 years. I was dependent on Dulcolax, which, while it solves the problem, it helps you, but it also destroys your kidney and some other internal organs. And since I came here, the treatment has been unorthodox, and highly effective. Now, that issue literally just disappeared overnight.
Like many others, Michael was skeptical about alternative medicine until he tried it and saw results. He's now advising others to have a second thought about the practice.
My experience here, has brought me to a level of understanding of alternative medicine. It is very, very effective, and it is brave. It is not afraid of delving into issues that modern science is afraid of going into without certain kinds of experiments.
Since Yoda founded her Kayana Health and Therapeutic Center in 2012, she's treated countless of cases. She now hopes to train more people to practice alternative medicine to achieve optimum health for everyone.
All I want is that let my generation have a good life. That look, apart from medicine, the natural way is the best.
Alternative medicine more or less conflicts with scientific or modern medicine, but the organic herbal treatment has been proven to be effective. Medical experts are now calling for a meeting point between standard and alternative medicine for the benefit of humanity. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
In Senegal, a man with a disability is rising in popularity locally and internationally because of his acrobatic talent. A former street child, Mamadou Aidara, now performs in schools and hospitals, hoping to inspire children.
Mamadou Aidara, commonly known as Junior, is in his 30s, and despite the hurdles presented by his special needs, resulting from poor healthcare response to polio infection, he is a well-known balancing acrobat.
When I was on the street, I had a very difficult life, like a homeless man. That's why every time I see street children, a lot of memories come to my mind. I remember that I used to spend all day and sleep without eating, and it breaks my heart. I was wondering at the time about things like, when will this nightmare end?
Today, Mamadou spends most of his time performing, and thanks to his cart and 2 iron bars, he can lift himself between 4 to 5 meters high.
When I do performances on TV, everyone comes out to see me in action in the streets. I am aware that this is no longer the time to give up. I no longer have time to close my eyes. I want to leave my mark.
And his unique performances are an inspiration to fans.
What impresses me about Junior is that he can do all these moves despite his physical condition. He's an extraordinary acrobat. I would like him to train young people who can take over, because it would be a pity to see this extraordinary talent disappear without him passing it on to others.
This young man has an undeniable talent, and I have heard about him for quite some time. There is also a side that is a little paradoxical to his profession, his handicap in the foot.
Mamadou volunteers to train young students in schools in Senegal, a duty he is proud of.
Every year, the children I train win 3 to 4 gold medals. I work as a volunteer and I work in the social field. All the students I train pay nothing, and I have trained many artists and acrobats. I also do many other shows for free in hospitals and in schools.
l'argent. Même il y a des spectacles que je fais.
Thanks to his strong display of talent, Mamadou is currently preparing for a European tour. His dream is not only to share his talent, but to also open a school to train future gymnastics champions and also help street children. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
We've got all the sports news coming up for you after the break, including the International Canoeing Federation spearheads first para-canoeing championship in Africa.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find